space. Round of applause for this. I'd also like to make a special shout out. Allison Shepard, can you please stand? Introductions. I love the story that was shared. She was kind enough to introduce me to Stephen and to Victor. And once I heard the story, it was just a no-brainer. We needed to share the story. We needed to make sure this got out into the community. I was born and raised here, and I'll be honest with you, it's not until the 400th celebration that we started learning about the history of our community. And there is some amazing history here in our community. And we want to try to highlight that throughout the whole entire 400. Our goal is to hopefully get some of this information into the school curriculum so that the students of the community can understand how special Chelsea really is, and how much we have to be proud of, and all the firsts that Chelsea had. So I would like to thank the City of Chelsea for allowing us to make this a 400th event, for my Chamber of Commerce for allowing us to host this. And without further ado, I just want to first and foremost, please make sure that you help yourself to the charcuterie board and the beverages in the back of the room. That was donated by Chelsea Station. They were kind enough to donate that, so I just want to say thank you there. And I also want to give a special shout out to Katie Butler. She's probably still downstairs manning the door, but she's part of the Eastern Salt team, and she was instrumental in helping me set this up and making the room look as beautiful as it does. So just a quick thank you to everyone. Quickly before we start, I just want to remind everybody, please check out the 400th website and check out the Chamber website along with the City of Chelsea. That's where you're going to find all the events that we're going to be hosting. On June 6th, we're going to host a follow-up event to this one, detailing the Battle of Chelsea Creek. We had a gentleman named Jeff Perlman who reached out to me. He's a historian from Revere, which was once North Chelsea. And he's kind enough to come over, and he wants to share his story or his presentation on the Battle of Chelsea Creek. So please register. Be sure to visit our swag table, and we have other events listed at the check-in table as you come in. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask myself or the team at the back of the room. Without further ado, Victor, please come on in and make your introduction.
I have deep roots in Chelsea as well. And I never heard of the battle until a colleague was sitting down with me when I worked for the state and said, hey, you ever do anything on these Revolutionary War battlefield studies? And I go, no, I said, Lexington and Concord. And he goes, no, they sank a ship over in Chelsea. And that's how I got introduced to this. At the same time, I've done a lot of work as a state. I worked for the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources. I was its director, the state underwater archaeologist, from 1987 till my retirement in 2019, though I don't feel like I'm retired because I get a call about every other week from my successor, and we discuss things. But anyway, those are my other affiliations. I just want to say that we never heard about this, and unfortunately my parents were long gone, and most of my relatives, my Chelsea roots all have now extinguished and gone to another plane. So I never got to share this with them. And I'll be honest as well, this is the first time in 2018 since I really gave an in-depth discussion of this. Though Stephen and I talk about this quite a bit. I talk about this battle a lot. So let me get going, because I'll talk forever. So this is more of one of my academic papers. So you have to bear with me sometimes. It'll be laden with jargon, and you can ask me questions, and I'll make up answers to suit my mood. But this really is the Battle of Chelsea Creek. And the reason we say that is not because it was ever named that until about 1976, when Revere Historical Commission did a study. And that's when the name really came out. The earliest studies talk about Noddles Island and Hog Island, but they aren't really the battlefield. They just happen to be listed in newspaper articles. And then 19th century historians picked up on that and sort of carried that mythology of a battle name forward. But let me sort of stop there with my sort of talking about that. So, May 27, 28, 1775, a month after Lexington and Concord, and a month before Bunker Hill, everyone's starting to notice the siege of Boston. They're starting to notice that the British and the provincial troops, and I don't call them American Revolutionary War soldiers yet, because they still had a certain loyalty to Britain. The provincial troops said, hey, all these supplies, we need to get them. And about 2 weeks before this engagement, there were orders given, never executed, to go over here and get all the sheep, cows, horses, either round them up or kill them and burn all the hay so that the British forces couldn't use them. But it gets lost because a month later, you have the Battle of Bunker Hill with horrendous loss of lives on both sides, a lot of local heroes, well-known figures that were killed, so it just disappears. I can have the next slide. So, as I sort of talk about this a little bit, and here's a colonial map, and here's the battlefield, and I call it Chelsea Creek because I grew up, it was Chelsea Creek, not the Chelsea River. Just so you know that my personal history gets involved with a lot, so there could be a debate over what it's called. The people at the National Ocean Service and I disagree. We'll make the note. But anyway, they don't understand, in New England, creeks can be a mile wide, not just a stepping stone. But I think what a lot of people forget is that we characterize this as a battle of firsts. It really was the first offensive operation of provincial troops, because Lexington and Concord was spontaneous. This was not something that was planned, we're going to do something. There's no planning, it just happened. You know, thank God it did, but it just happened. It is the first instance of military cooperation during the Revolution of the colonies. So you have Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts troops combined, planning together. Some people get a lot of credit later on in their lives, like General Putnam. At the beginning of this battle, he was nowhere. He came near the end. He was not a planner of this. It's the first use of artillery. And it's kind of funny, because we were always trying to figure out where this Newgate House was in Revere. We couldn't quite pinpoint it. Recently, a gentleman, through intermediaries, sent me the location where he believes through deed searches he found it. Which is great, because if we do another level of research on this site, or the sites involved, we can go back and talk about that. They brought two artillery pieces, I think they were 4-pounders. You're going to find that I forget names, how many weapons, what types, doesn't matter. That's what I usually have staff for. It was the first naval engagement. The Gaspee in Rhode Island is pre-revolution. I know that there's a lot of grass trying to bring it up to be part of the beginning of the American Revolution. It's pre-revolution. This is just a tax revolt. It's nothing to do with total independence. And there was in Machias, Maine, they rowed out and took a British vessel. It wasn't a battle. They just rowed out and captured it. And that's about the same time period, so I think it was just after. And finally, this wasn't an American battlefield victory, because this wasn't a battlefield. This is what they call a running engagement. It's not planned, there's no positions, things happen. Next slide. So, you don't need to read all this if you want to find out this narrative. I'm going to tell you, the report we did is a whole section, an annotated bibliography in there where you can read everything we could find. But essentially, the descriptions are, we squatted down in a ditch in the marsh. And the accent's right in there, marsh. Ordered us over a knoll, kind of spelled interesting, right into the mouths of cannon. What knoll? And even here, set us on the ferryways at Winnissimmet. Well, I know where the cobblestone road is, but where is the ferryways? And there's a debate, and I'm very happy to debate it. But really what happens here is, did our predecessor historians fill in gaps where they thought logically information would be there? So we find that a lot of times the late 19th century or early histories and the early 20th century histories are often filling in. The authors assume things that we can't find data on. So we're left with questions like, how do we then document this event? And how did it play out on the landscape? And that's the key. How does it play out on the landscape? And that's really what our analysis is. The next slide. So, it's hard to see, but, you know, pretty urban industrial landscape. It's all gray on the USGS topo sheets. That always tells me it's industrial. I grew up, I knew a lot of these landmarks and places, and I know that there's lots of greenery, but it looks from the surface completely changed. But we're going to find out it really isn't. In fact, we're going to be surprised at how much it didn't change. Next slide. And I keep looking down at my notes because I sometimes will forget things, and I don't need this slide as much. So we created base maps. And there are all these reconstructing Boston maps out there. There's a couple of books. The failures of those books are the details. They get the shoreline. The shoreline's pretty well known, the historic shoreline. The state did a study, Coastal Zone Management did an extensive study of shoreline change back in the 80s and 90s. So there's a lot of data out there, and all these books have it. But no one thinks about all the other details on a map. And a map is not just the edge of the river, it's what's behind that. So we needed to create base maps. And we found that we were really disappointed because the accuracy of maps, depending on who wrote them and for what purpose, varies. But the most reliable maps were from the U.S. Coastal Survey, which still exists today as part of the National Ocean Service. They do maps, but we were able to reference them. What we do in referencing a map, we typically will look for certain features on that map and see if they line up today. And those are how you can then overlay maps. When I first started doing archaeology back in the 70s, we would take Xeroxes and transparencies and play with them in order to get that overlay. Not very accurate, but it gets you to that point. Next slide. And then we also did what they call a digital elevation map, and this was really telling to us. So if you'll notice all the high points and the shapes, Orient Heights or Hog Island, very similar historically. I always thought growing up that when they put the railroad in, they cut that bank out for the highway and for the railroad. That end of the drummer has always been a shot break. So it's a landscape feature that showed up pretty well and helped us figure out things in the story, the narrative. And also, we assigned values, not just the height, but swamp or marsh features, water features, all have different values, so allow us to create these GIS maps. Next slide. And then we did this. We took that information, and now what you see, this red line is the current waterfront. So there's all this area, the inputs filled in. From my backyard, by the way, I live in West Peabody, and that's where the pits were that they brought the gravel fill for the Logan Airport from. So this area, Nautilus, Hog, the meeting house, which still exists today, though it appears to be turned 180 degrees on its axis. Winnisimmett Village, because I didn't know that name until I did the study. My mother lived and worked in Chelsea, she never mentioned it. Charlestown, Eastie, all what we can see the fill, but also we now see the shapes, we know where the real images of the harbor is in 1775. Fairly reliable. Next slide. So what we did for our study is we did what they call COCOA. That's a military analysis technique, which talks about, and I have to read this because I can never remember all of the features in it. It talks about things like the different parts of the terrain. So sort of key are the sites of the terrain, observation areas and fields, fire, cover and concealment, obstacles and avenues of advance and withdrawal. And you notice I use withdrawal. We don't talk about retreat. There's no retreat in this battle, only withdrawal. And there's a distinct difference. So here is the key terrain. And so usually we think of high ground. So Nautilus are really, where East Boston High School is. The Middle Farm, which is the area just before you get that, just before you get to Orient Heights, and I'm trying to think of what a good street name is, I can't. So you got Hog Island, which is Orient Heights, Mill Hill, which is where the illegal wind turbine is, Mount Bellingham. I didn't know it was called Mount Bellingham. Played this study. I was really surprised. I knew about Bellingham Square, but I never knew about Mount Bellingham. And of course, Winnissipeg Village. But we always have to remember the navigable waterway is a key landscape feature, especially in this engagement. Next slide. So we talk about observation, who saw what, which is important to tell the narrative of this story. Because we have little things like, it was only when the captain of the Preston saw people burning hay that they even knew anything was going on. The troops had all come down, and I'll get into the battle later, until they had a fire, until they started burning. He didn't see smoke, no one saw smoke. He then noticed provincial soldiers in there. But he could see Winnissipeg Village, he could see a little bit of the uplands, a little bit as you go to Powderhorn Hill. So the soldiers home.
Where are we on that?
Where are we on
Where are we
that?
now? Yeah.
I'm gonna have to get myself over here, and we're probably somewhere in this area.
Okay.
So this is filled tidelands, formerly shipyards. Let's see. So you can see this is the British, and then we're going to the provincial troops. So that, by the way, the troops are coming in from Medford. So they muster in Medford. They actually came down from New Hampshire, up from Connecticut, and from sort of the Concord, Acton, that whole region. And they all mustered in Medford, not Cambridge. They were in Medford. Or Medford, as we and they marched over to the Chelsea Meeting House, which is still there. There's a funeral home on one side, and I believe it's a medical type building on the other, the old meeting house. You'll have to forgive me because, again, it's been 10 plus years since I've done all my driving around and used up all your state resources and gas. But, so they could see, they couldn't really see the British fleet, but they could see certain areas. So if you came in from the meeting house, you get a good view of the marshes. All right, next slide. And of course, we call it fields of fire, so where vessels are, where positions are, where they can aim their weapons. And it's usually not 360 degrees, because they're only going to aim it at the enemy, but also where they could reach. So cannon can go about 200 yards that they were using. They were using it, I think the largest was 4-pounders. They couldn't get very far, but you basically have the Britannia, which is a sloop, was like a schooner. It was a little bit small. It was a sloop of war. And the Diana actually stationed here originally, and they moved up the creek. But they could create fields of fire as they went along. And then the troops could, also on the land, could actually create fields of fire. So we do certain areas. And there's not really much going on with these swamps. Can I have the next slide? I'm ahead of myself a little bit. So cover and concealment. Basically, you hide in the marshes, you hide behind the stone walls in the village. You go in the ditch, which some people have characterized as first use of trench warfare, which it wasn't, because actually there were trenches in the French and Indian Wars up in Quebec, so it really wasn't part of that. But you can't really call them that. But they dumped in a ditch, and it's really basically marshland, so they can hide. Tide is up or tide's down. You got the marsh, the channels within them. And then obstacles, it's an important feature. The river is both a means of movement, so if it's key terrain because if it facilitates the battle, but it also is an obstacle because what people don't realize is that it was a full lunar high tide. And we've had that verified by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. That memory stuff. They actually did tidal projection, so we could actually look and see where the tide was. So that schooner had a prevailing wind that pushed it up the creek, towing barges or longboats, and then at a high tide, so they could get way up into the Chelsea Creek River. And we assume they're probably all the way up almost to the mill, but not quite. This is where it gets confusing because it's not good testimony. But there's other ways that we can eventually determine that. So there's obstacles. Let's go on. And there's movement of advance. So what happens is the British see the provincial troops on noddles, burning hay, trying to round up sheep, horses, cows. They gather Marines from the various vessels in the fleet, and they land at Williams' mansion, which is interesting because Williams is actually the provincial quartermaster. So he's not going to get a lot of sympathy in the end of this story. But they land there, so basically they're at Maverick Station, and they go inward. And what's nice, when I look at the maps, and this is really what's cool about reconstructing the maps, both Bennington Street and Saratoga Street and Broadway show up as distinct, consistent avenues. They may be swaying a little bit east and west, north and south, but essentially the same path. So it helps us tell the story. So they move up, and basically, Starbucks is up here. That's that street. Oh, God help me. The street where Starbucks goes into Eastie, right below Orient Heights.
1A.
No, well, I know it's 1A, but no. At the traffic light, when it turns to the left.
Suffolk Downs, isn't that?
No, after Suffolk Downs. Oh, God, I keep thinking Stockton, and it's not Stockton. Anyway, that is actually a valley or a creek. And if you get up on the top of Orient Heights, and I think that's later in this, you can actually look down and you can actually visualize the depression. Though now with the other hotels there, it's kind of been more difficult to discern. But in 2012, I believe, when we took, it was 2011 maybe, you could actually get at the top of Orient Heights and you could see it. Plus it's a great panoramic view. But the British troops move up, the Diane moves up, and it's all kind of dotted in here because I can't quite figure out what happened when that vessel, and I'll say she because that's traditionally how we refer to ships, even though it should be, have no gender distinction. But essentially, originally the troops come down, and they go out and down and around and over. By the way, the Chelsea militia, provincial troops, were out at Pullen Point, because that's where we anticipated the British to land originally during the siege of Boston, to come around and do basically a wing attack, so lateral into the provincial lines. So we miss out on the people who know the landscape the best are not at home. They're miles away watching for an enemy that doesn't show up. So you got all these boys from New Hampshire and Connecticut coming down. And as a little aside, the reason we have New Hampshire and Connecticut troops are mostly New Hampshire, the local militia that was there mutinied. And I can't find the detailed records, but they decided since they were going to have to serve under captains they didn't know, they weren't going. So these other troops were sent. So they didn't have good sense, but they come over, and then at a certain point they basically go back and forth. They come down into the village, so down Broadway, maybe Washington Avenue. All right, and then you've got the withdrawal, so they basically do the same thing, same routes, trying to get in and out of the area. Next slide. So this is the sequence of the battle, or I should say the engagement. It starts out with basically at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they see the provincial troops doing their raid. The British respond. So the provincial troops basically had come down probably somewhere in the area of Eagle Hill, Eagle Point. And at that point, they have to turn around and head back because the Marines are coming up. What's interesting to me in that whole story is that they get up there and they cross, not Sail Creek, but the creek that's right there, and they stop. The British troops don't advance. We have not found any orders that said go this far. Why didn't they go that far? Why didn't they go further? Because the Diana, at the same time, is actually moving up. So they create a rearguard action. The Diana can fire on the troops in this area. So basically, the area around the bottom where they're all fighting over Starbucks. They all wanted their land. There was basically a heated exchange there. And you can imagine that you probably get several hundred British troops with their brown vest rifles, which aren't very accurate. And then provincial troops with their long rifles, probably several thousand, conceivably, but probably at least 1,000, so at least 3-to-1 odds. And there's an exchange, and they're trying to get away from the Diana, who has got 4-pounders, 4, fire natter, and swivel guns. So they can probably reach them, though the accuracy is a little bit off. And then the diameter just keeps moving up as the troops move out. And they get up to that point where the Chelsea River Creek turns into Mill Creek. So you're going towards Slate's Mills. At that elbow, behind the hotel, that's where it kind of gets fuzzy, what happened. Because actually, those creeks in there, like the one behind the Revere Police Station, is in the place it was. And that was somewhat navigable. So it could have gone up that way a little bit, but there's no clear documentation. And one thing I should point out, people have a misconception about ship's logs. They're the best records for weather, but they really don't tell you what else was happening, for the most part. So you have to go look for other evidence. But they get up in here, and it's the end of the high tide, the wind drops, and they run aground. So those 10 to 12 longboats that are sitting behind them with troops, those people are getting hammered. Because you've got up in here, you've got a couple of cannon from the provincial side shooting at them, all along this side where Mill Hill is, they're getting fired at. So that whole area, the uplands in that area, is shooting at those troops there. What then happens is, to get the Diana out, they couldn't what they call catch her. They couldn't drop an anchor and then sort of pull her. Those Marines and sailors in the longboats had to row and haul her back. So if any of you saw the Mutiny on the Bounty when they go dead sail and they're all out in the boats towing, basically the same thing, and that's pretty brutal work when you're taking a 100-ton vessel and trying to bring it forward. Then she comes down, and you've got basically the area in the village. The vessel, because it has no control with the tide and winds, runs aground again. And it goes up 60 yards off the ferryways. We don't know exactly how far out the ferryways went. We don't actually know where the ferry landing was. For a while we postulated it was the late 19th century ferry landing, but that area's been manipulated. We don't really know if the end of Winnissimmet Street, or Winnissimmet Street is. Why do I always change the name? Is that spot or not? And eventually, they strip the vessel when she's run aground because the British abandoned her, so it becomes captured. And then during the night, Lieutenant Graves comes back to try to recover his vessel. He's repelled, and all he can do is remove wounded. So I can go to the next slide. And that's sort of what happens in this 2-day engagement or battle. So what we had to do with our study, and this is sort of what the Park Service wanted from us, is find what they call key features. So the ferryways in Winnissimmet, where the cannon may have been on Noddle's Island. So we pretty much they say Eagle Point or Eagle Hill in one of the references, Williams Mansion, and we take these points and we geo-reference them. We actually get Latin law derived from these maps. And when we drive out to these spots and look at them, and pretty much the area east of Maverick Station is where the mansion was at some point in time. But that far inland, because the wharf was far out. We sort of know where the burning buildings are. What happens, landscape features on older historic maps, if they're made for navigation, you can pretty much be guaranteed that if it's a structure, it's pretty accurately fixed so that the person offshore can see it. None of the maps were made for navigation. Even the British Admiralty maps that we had access to, and there are others we had found, couldn't give us those accurate points. We sort of know that there were burning buildings up in there. As we move over here, we know roughly Crooked Creek, which is basically Suffolk Downs. And by the way, you know that in the middle of Suffolk Downs is a creek?
Right.
That actually shows up historically. So that's not like they made the creek in the middle to make it look nice. That was there. They didn't fill it in. Something to bear in mind for development. I can't step in that reader yet. As you get up towards the head of the river or creek, where did the vessel ground? Where were the provincial positions? We can probably make this cannon position more accurate now. now that we have a landmark that someone has given us, we can actually go back and move that a little bit. But these become defining features, things that we know are related to the battle. Whether they exist today in a preserved state is a different matter. Go to the next slide. And what we did find, though, by driving around, because this isn't done, we could not do under this permit and grant, we could do no excavation. So we had to base this on what we could see. So let's see, where are we? So you've got basically the dry dock next to the Marine Street Bridge. So that side of it, between there and probably the Tobin, is where we postulate where the ferry landing is and where the Diana might be. Unfortunately, in my heart of hearts, I'm afraid that it's probably under the global oil terminal down there that has been filled in. That's just a possibility. Could be under the yacht club. It's certainly not the receiving wharf for the old Navy hospital, which is still there. I don't think it was that far over. So you've got that one feature, and this is really important because I think there is archaeology we could do that, with some technology, determine whether there's something there. We could probably also go over to the end of Bennington, where the rotary is. It's not quite there. If you think about the ball fields that are just behind that rotary going to the west, it's probably that area where the ditches were. Might be able to do some remote sensing that we could say, oh, there's a ditch. But even with archaeology, we'd have to be really lucky, like find a button, a bunch of lead shot, to say that that's actually the spot where the provincial troops squatted down and fired back. So you get 17 guys holding back 300 Marines. Pretty tough people. I mean, British Marines are not someone you wanted to mess with. So, and then the area up here at the head of the creek, where the Diana first grounded, and there was intense, as they called it, heavy fire. And when you read the court-martial testimony, and as an aside, all vessel losses result in a court-martial. The fact that Lieutenant Graves' uncle was Admiral Graves, who assembled the court, no one was found guilty. I don't think he was guilty. It's no negligence. This is just the facts of what happened. And all the testimonies almost virtually identical. So they must have rehearsed quite a bit. But up in here, we probably, so if you look at these maps, and you see, so here's the ball fields for near Bennington, and, God, I can't think of the name, street, but there's probably areas to test. Here would be interesting, and again, this is remote sensing archaeology. If the vessel grounded up in there, what you would find is a concentration of lead and iron shot. So you'd have bullets, cannonballs that had bounced off of the hull and been dispersed, and also shot at the sailors and Marines behind them in the longboats. So we actually find those remnants. Because the dredging doesn't go up that far. The dredging stops basically at the finger piers, just beyond the finger piers that Global Oil has here. By the way, there's several wrecks in there, which in 1988 they had to come down and look at one because that person was convinced he found the Diana, which I didn't know the story either at that point. And I looked at it and I go like, this vessel's like almost 200 feet long. I don't know a schooner that big. Two-masted schooners are not that large. So up in here, and there's another wreck up in there, but that's sort of the story of the whole battle. The Diana is pivotal because we had a victory. We captured the vessel. Did it have a big effect on the battle? Probably not, except it didn't stop Lieutenant Graves' career. He became an admiral in the end. Just like his uncle probably pushed him along, like most people in those period navies. There's a lot of influence as well as skill. And he probably was a real learning experience for him. But so there are several places here that we could look. There's probably more places, and as we get more information in the story, and we'll sort of really strong locational data, we can go out and do different kinds of testing. I want to test here and here. This is going to be, the chances of success are so low. I just don't think it'll happen. My final slide is I have to do my acknowledgements, because even though I no longer work for the state, and I'm no longer under a contract with the feds, for this project, I have to thank the American Battlefield Protection Program for their financial support. It put 2 graduate students through, one through his master's and one a chapter of his dissertation, and that's these 2 gentlemen, Dr. Craig Brown, who now works for International Archaeology in Guam, and Dr. Chris Mayo, who's a professor at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. But we had help from UMass, from the Environmental Sciences program, Alan Gons, who actually is at Clarkson now, and Steve Rosowski, who's still at UMass. Coastal Zone Management, really only Dan Sampson. Emily moved her family down to North Carolina and was very successful there. Duranda didn't ask this associates, an environmental consulting firm, but Steve and I worked together at Coastal Zone, and he actually helped us find maps and get them georeferenced. And finally, Charlie Fry from Esri, which is an environmental map company, had done Battle of Bunker Hill as a GIS project. Turned out that he had a familial connection with both Bunker Hill and Chelsea Creek. There's a Fry and Farnsworth that he's related to. So it kind of gave him that personal connection. And of course the board, when I was there, I have to thank the board members because they allowed me to have fun with work. And with that, I can make up answers. I'll answer any questions, and we can talk a little bit about Diana, because it's a very interesting book.
Does anyone have any questions? Would anyone like to make any comments? Does anyone, and please, don't be shy. Yes, Matt.
So I had read somewhere once, and like I said, I'm not a historian, so I'm not fully sure if it was accurate or not, that they had taken the mast off the Diana and marched it to Union Square in Somerville. Is that a legitimate?
I followed up on that. I'm Steve Kirkchin. I retired reporter for the Boston Globe, and I hooked up with Victor in this effort about two and a half years ago, and have stayed interested in it and hopeful that these remnants of wood, these wood remnants that I've found with the help of another friend, might be the Diana. They're having the wood tested, something called dendro, which is wood, right?
Correct. It's tree rings, but they're also talking about carbon dating as well. There seems to be a possibility.
Possible. But, so we're mid-course, we're swimming across the channel there. But I remain fascinated by this and have been since I talked to a Revolutionary War historian, and I grew up in Boston, so I know much of the Revolutionary War history. And when I told him that there's a possibility that we might have found the HMS Diana, and this was 2 years ago we talked about, he said, I want to join you. That is the most significant, unrecognized, untold story of the Revolutionary War. And as I read Victor's report, and I continue to read it day in and day out, to see little markings on it, to see where the could this place, these remnants that I've found, could they be the Diana? I just remain convinced when I think of the mast. I found a guy over in Somerville who said that mast was moved. It may have been moved to Washington. This was they took it to Cambridge, where Washington was staying.
Right.
But it may have, then it landed up in Somerville, and it stayed there, right by the monument up there. What's up atop the hill in Somerville?
It's a high point. It is one of the highest points in these surrounding drumlins.
Powder
Powder, yeah. And there's a great old gent. He'll get the more I have fun with the guys who remember stuff. And he said, but it was taken down and buried. And right by the monument there is a little path with some grass around it. And he said it may be buried under here. But is that it? You know, we just sort of feeling our way through this story. And
If it's a mast, wouldn't it still have the metal?
So you know,
If it was a mast, a ship's mast?
mast, M-A-S-T, yeah.
Wouldn't it still have the metal, like the
So you could
frame?
figure it out?
Yeah,
Well, there's a lot of things to do, but that may be one of the more important ones. The reason that I love this story is the more you read about the battle of that day, May 27th and May 28th, the more you realize the fervency, the drive, the intensity of the people living along the creek. They joined in. So the Revolutionary War spirit, which I don't think we know about. We can't put our finger on it, say, you know, but they're all wearing Bruins. That's the way I see it. They're all North Shore people, and they know what they want. And what they want is and Victor's report is a step by step by step.
I have to give them credit.
Achievement. Well, you may have to give them credit, but I know whose hands are on the wheel is on this whole thing.
But, you know, what you think about that mast, there's a gentleman, now deceased, may he rest in peace, in Acton who had a cannon, which he fervently believed had been removed from the Diana. Sending markings to England, it like post-dates it by a decade. Never told him. He's gone to his... Because I only found out maybe a year before he passed away, and I was like, how do you tell this guy that your research says he's right? He spent a lot of time explaining this and really talking about the battle. It's the right size, it's just the markings suggest it's more recent by a decade. Which, you think, a decade? Well, yeah, they're pretty accurate in how they trace things. If there's good seals on it, just like on the back of a plate, when you see those marks, they're very accurate. Getting back to this person's question about, the iron was probably removed because the metal is in short supply, you need it, it's not necessary to make that mast basically a flagpole. So they probably removed it, and that would have been the hold, that mast would have been hold, like the booms, because I think the Diana was just a gaff-rigged schooner. And that's really what, for archaeologists, especially maritime historians, stuff at that time period, the British Navy, since the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, loved American schooners. They were fast, they were very maneuverable, they could go into shallow water. And the Diana was one of them. The problem for the Diana is, where was that vessel built? It could have been built anywhere from Maryland to Newfoundland. That's what you call that period of schooner. They're very ubiquitous. The designs are very similar, and it was probably a real basic boat. So I always get upset when I see the one that's there with, it's got two square masts at the top. It's like, wrong time period. This is an earlier vessel, and it's smaller. She's 100 tons. 100 tons isn't a big ship. It's like 65 feet. So, or maybe 70, maybe 80. But it's not a big vessel because it's very maneuverable. That's why it can go way up this creek because it doesn't draw a lot of water and it can move fast. I'll make up questions if you want. Did you recognize?
Can I ask a follow-up to the mast stuff? Is there the ability that they put a hat on top of it to kind of, in a mocking way?
They might have. I mean, these are very common things that would have been done. But you also, as I sort of mentioned earlier historians, sort of, not the contemporary people writing it, but diaries, but people 100 years later recording them, or even Putnam, 40 years after the battle, talks about his involvement. Yeah, he waited somewhere out here with a matchlock, or with a flintlock, but that's probably his only effort in that battle. He was not a commander or whatever, but he made it sound like He rallied the troops. These guys were hot. They were going. This was not like, oh my God, they're shooting at us. It's like, no, we're getting them. They still had that, what happened in Lexington and Concord was still on. Basically, Stark, who was up in New Hampshire, as soon as he heard about Lexington and Concord, he stopped plowing the field, literally stopped plowing the field, got his weapon, his powder horn, and came south. And he dragged people with him. He was, what probably doesn't come up, he was a ranger during the French and Indian War. So was Colonel Nixon. So you have these two people that really were in the really toughest part of battles, coming right to this spot. It's just amazing if we could find out more about some of the other officers, and it's not really given. I have not found muster rolls. The same with the British. We're not clear whether these troops from the Pitcairn or not, because we know he went out to Lexington and Concord, and he did command a lot of the Marines when they gathered it. But most Marines were assigned individually to vessels. So they had to be brought together as a unit, not a cohesive unit. So there's lots of little things in the stories that really, if someone could find the data, the diary data, or letter data, it would really help. And I'll be quite honest, we never got to England because the feds would not allow us to spend any money on out-of-U.S. travel. So we didn't get there. We got the court-martial papers through friends. Basically asked a friend to ask a friend who found them and copied them and sent them.
So was there a lot of stuff that you wanted to receive or to pursue overseas?
Oh, everywhere. I mean, I'm trained as both a maritime historian and as an archaeologist. There's always more. There's always a new question. In England, it would be trying to figure out where the records actually went. We tried to find Graves' personal papers. Graves is actually a very common naval name. There are several admirals named Graves. In fact, the admiral here, there's a similar admiral at the same time, same name. We got in touch with that family, and it's like, no, that's not my relative, but we do have his papers. That relative's papers have nothing to do with our battle. But I'm feeling more like, did somebody, any correspondence? And Stark's papers, unfortunately, were dispersed. There was a family dispute at some point in time, and they didn't stay with New Hampshire. They went wherever the family members wanted, they take them. So they're not centralized. And that would have been probably the best because he was probably the most active commander in this engagement. Now, I'll go back to England. I love London, so I'd go back to the Kew or Greenwich and see if I could find more records. I mean, I'd like to find a bill of sale. If I could find a bill of sale for Diana, that would tell us a lot.
Yeah, we don't even know. Diana was commissioned by the Brits in early 1775, and I think in someone's journal it says that the boat had been built and sailed for a year before it was commissioned by the Brits.
Right.
So
Still a new boat.
huh?
Still very new.
Still a very new boat. Maybe it's time. Maybe.
Sure.
What did you discover, or what new thing did you discover that doing your research about this event that either filled in more information about the war or taught you something about?
No one knows about this battle, the importance of this battle, until that.
But when Philbrick did his recent book on the Revolution, The Siege of Boston, this became an integral part. It basically helped us do our interpretation because we're always thinking about, okay, this event occurred, we know why it occurred, but we didn't think it in that larger picture. So you're really thinking about what happens right after Lexington and Concord, all the way up to the British evacuation, which used to be one of my favorite holidays. St. Patrick aside, it was one of my favorite holidays. Because at that point, it's a whole series of events that basically pushed the British out of Boston. And this was an integral part of that, because they didn't come over here after that. They basically stayed in East Boston and not very much, because the resources weren't there anymore, and they knew they were going to attack. The same on the other side. Grape Island was another exchange on the south of Boston.
Do you have a question?
Oh, yes. Have there been any other artifacts discovered on the battle site?
Well, we looked at, the only place that we've seen artifacts, the Revere Historical Society, I can't think of their proper name, they had 2 cannonballs. From what we looked at them, they're too large. So we think they're actually probably either the bombardments that occurred in relationship to Bunker Hill or just before that, because they, British had, after this, they were sporadically, okay, you want to fight? Yeah, we'll tease you a little bit. So you have these kind of incidents where they just fire, but they're too large. A couple of people came forward with these ceramic spheres from Mill Hill area. Those are actually paint tumblers. If you look at that area, they're the right size for shot. I found records where they've used stone shot, and I found, but usually the British didn't need stone shot. They had the lead and they had the iron to make shot. These are actually what happens when you take the lithographic paint, the raw paints, and you basically break them down. These ceramic, they're actually almost octagonal, will break down and they'll actually round, become spheres over time. And that's the only explanation for those, because if they're all just spheres, I'd say, could be. But when I see all this different stages of reduction, that's the breaking down, they can't be battlefield. And I've seen it on eBay. Buy, this relic from the Battle of Chelsea Creek. It's like, oh, well, good luck to you, buddy. Salesman was good.
The fellow who brought me to the story no longer lives in Boston, but when it was in the Boston Globe 2010, that he was starting this project, this friend of mine, was living up on Chelsea Hill with a hospital there had been, and he got in a skiff, and he paddled his way up to the creek where he found this remnants, and he went down where he thought the bilge would be. He came up with a coin, British coin. He said that coin is
1775.
1775. So it spurred me on.
And we also,
But I'm a reporter, and a reporter usually likes to have a little
this
sense.
also was a study area for another person, had nothing to do with the battle. And the late Jim Karras was when I did the state program.
Forgot the word great.
Yes, he was great. He was an avocational archaeologist, wanted to learn more, and he wanted a project. And I had just actually looked at the wrecks over by Global Oil. And, they're probably post-Civil War, but they're kind of neat, and they're big. And he decided that he wanted to take on a project, and he created a photo mosaic of many of the remnants there. And as time went on, he explored that area of the creek. He would go up to the one legal, parking spot by the mill where anybody could park, that usually has a car in it that shouldn't be. Bring his kayak, and he'd kayak down to his permit area and just study and photograph. He actually created a very hands-on technique had a step ladder, had a timer for his camera, and he did a photo mosaic, which I have some for display. The state, I think, is just put away now. They don't have it they don't have an office anymore. It's hundreds of photographs, and if you do them at 75% overlap, because people think, oh, just do a little bit. No, you want overlap, you want to play. It's beautiful. It's something I could actually take measurements off of and tell you stuff about the vessel in terms of its build. Unfortunately, it wasn't that old, and he looked at other remnants. He's looked at another remnant that Stephen has been looking at as well, and I got my successors come out and actually taken samples off of that. People don't realize that these creeks were the junkyards. They just drag the vessel up and leave it. And this creek had a lot of that, though during the work project administration during the 30s, a lot of wrecks were taken out. They didn't catch the area over here by the local station on the other side of the bridge in East Boston. There's a huge graveyard right there. They didn't do that one for some reason, but there are a lot of vessels abandoned. That's just what was happening. In those days, you just get rid of it, you know? Fishermen would just sink them.
Put it up on Chelsea Creek.
Yeah, put up in Chelsea Creek. Nobody lived there. So what did it matter? You
I
know?
think they used to burn them on the islands too.
Yeah.
By the airport.
They burned them for the metal. They burned them for the iron and the brass, because there was still a salvage value. Nut Island was what they call a breaking yard. Go up and break the vessels. There's one right up at the airport now that's from being broken up. If you look at the main channel, there's like a divot into the airport. There's a wreck right in there. I couldn't tell you what it is. But if you be lucky enough to fly out or come in on that runway, you'll see it at the right time. It shows up in the aerial photographs, oh God, Google Earth. You go, and then archaeologists, we use Google Earth all the time. I've looked at this creek many days,
Right.
on Google Earth, this area. You get a lot of information.
Does anyone have any other questions? Would anyone like to add anything? Do we have any fellow historians in the room that would like to share anything?
The two remnants of hulls up there in the tanks,
Yeah,
how old do you think those
I
are?
think they're post-Civil War. Probably they were coming in with coal. But we were doing some research at one point in time. We saw reference to ceramics being made, like kilns up in that area, where they thought maybe they come in with the coal and they get the cargo to leave. And what probably happened to the vessels that are abandoned, they broke the back. The keel gets so rotten, it snaps. You can't float that. It's not worth trying to fix. And it's unfortunate that we can't have been able to come up with like a name. And maybe if someone diligently and luckily hit it off with old newspapers, they might come up with a name. But it'd be pretty serendipitous.
Any other questions in the room? Any other comments? No?
Well, thank you all. I mean, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This research again.
And I'd like to thank Allison Shepherd again for making the introduction of us three and us four.
But I'd like to thank you for seeing, when we first talked about this, you said, what happened? And you said, what happened? Why didn't I ever know about this? And that curiosity, that interest kept Victor and I going. That was very,
I proudly say I'm a product of Chelsea, and
Right.
I say that very proudly.
I know
And
that.
with this, I'm hoping that we can continue to educate the younger generation so that we don't lose what we're learning now as
Right.
adults, and we can pay it forward and pass it along. So I appreciate everyone that's in this room this evening. I hope you took a little nugget away that you'll be able to share with someone so that we can keep the story alive. And for those historians that are in the room from other communities, I appreciate you coming out. I'm looking forward to learning more about your history and your communities. But knowledge is everything. And I think that this was a great opportunity to just learn a little bit something about your surroundings that you might not have known. So again, thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate you.